Have you ever felt utterly exhausted, not because you're lazy, not because you gave up, but simply because you've tried for far too long? You wake up each day, doing everything right, thinking harder, doing more, and yet nothing changes. Why does it still feel stuck? Maybe the problem isn't you. Maybe the real issue is the belief that more effort always equals more progress, when in truth, that belief might be silently draining you. There comes a moment when you just feel worn out, deep down, completely drained. Not because you're weak, not because you're lazy, but because you've been carrying too much for too long. You've kept showing up. You've done everything right. You've tried fixing, adjusting, overthinking, overdoing, believing that if you just tried a little harder, things would finally shift. But they don't. And what's worse, it's not just frustrating, it's soul-crushing. Like pouring every last piece of yourself into a life that refuses to pour anything back. And slowly, you start questioning yourself. Questioning your choices. Wondering if something's broken inside of you. Wondering if, maybe you are the problem. But what if you're not? What if the real issue isn't that you haven't tried hard enough, but that you've been taught a lie? A lie that says effort is everything, and trusting life is weakness. A lie that tells you to keep forcing, fixing, controlling, instead of flowing, listening, aligning. The Stoics knew this truth long ago. Peace doesn't come from controlling everything, but from living in harmony with life's natural rhythm. Marcus Aurelius didn't force the world to bend. He trained his mind to meet the world exactly as it is. Maybe that is the shift we need. Less forcing, more flowing. Less panic, more presence. And the more you trust, the less you'll feel the need to struggle. Not because you stop caring, but because you stop wasting your energy on things that were never yours to carry in the first place. There's a kind of strength, a quiet, powerful strength, that only reveals itself when you stop chasing and start listening. And if something in you feels seen right now, if this message helps you breathe a little deeper, feel a little lighter, then I ask for just one small, free gesture. Click that subscribe button. It tells me you're no longer performing for the world. You're ready to start transforming. Let's keep walking this path of clarity, calm, and quiet strength, together. Do you know why it hurts so deeply? When everything stays still, no matter how much of your heart you've poured in. It's not just the stagnation that aches. It's not just the waiting, or the stillness, or the sense that nothing is changing. It's what we make that stillness mean. You see, we've been taught, subtly, repeatedly, that effort is a kind of currency. The more you give, the more you matter. The harder you work, the more you're worth. So what happens when you give everything? When you stretch yourself to your limits, emotionally, mentally, even physically, and life gives you silence in return? It doesn't just feel like failure. It feels personal. As if the quiet is saying something about you. As if your value is tied to the response you didn't get. Not about strategy. Not about timing. Not about alignment. But you. And that belief, is dangerous. A lie we swallowed so early, and so often, that we never thought to question it. We learned to stay busy, to always be doing, always moving. As if constant motion could shield us from disappointment. As if being endlessly productive could somehow protect us from pain. But what if the problem was never your discipline? never your hustle, never your self-sacrifice? What if the real issue is something deeper? Something buried inside the way we were trained to think. That we should only trust what we can control. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And that's exactly what so many of us do. We grip every task. We clutch every goal. We tighten our hold on every relationship. Believing, hoping, that if we just try hard enough, we can prevent things from falling apart. But this constant grasping, this relentless striving, it isn't strength. It's survival. And survival doesn't leave space for trust. Survival only knows how to perform, how to cling, how to overcompensate. It only knows how to say, "If I let go, everything will collapse." But here's what no one ever taught us. Trust is not weakness. Trust is not passive. And trust is definitely not giving up. True trust is active. It's a deliberate choice. It takes clarity. It takes courage. It requires you to breathe deeper, to take one step back, and say, "I don't know exactly how this will work out. But I no longer need to force it." Letting go doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop gripping so hard that you lose yourself in the process. Do you know why it hurts so deeply? When everything stays still, no matter how much of your heart you've poured in. It's not just the stagnation that aches. It's not just the waiting, or the stillness, or the sense that nothing is changing. It's what we make that stillness mean. You see, we've been taught, subtly, repeatedly, that effort is a kind of currency. The more you give, the more you matter. The harder you work, the more you're worth. So what happens? When you give everything, when you stretch yourself to your limits, emotionally, mentally, even physically, and life gives you silence in return? It doesn't just feel like failure. It feels personal. As if the quiet is saying something about you. As if your value is tied to the response you didn't get. Not about strategy. Not about timing. Not about alignment. But you. And that belief, is dangerous. A lie we swallowed so early, and so often, that we never thought to question it. We learned to stay busy, to always be doing, always moving. As if constant motion could shield us from disappointment. As if being endlessly productive could somehow protect us from pain. But what if the problem was never your discipline? Never your hustle? Never your self-sacrifice? What if the real issue is something deeper? Something buried inside the way we were trained to think. That we should only trust what we can control. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And that's exactly what so many of us do. We grip every task. We clutch every goal. We tighten our hold on every relationship. Believing, hoping, that if we just try hard enough, we can prevent things from falling apart. But this constant grasping, this relentless striving, it isn't strength. It's survival. And survival doesn't leave space for trust. Survival only knows how to perform, how to cling, how to overcompensate. It only knows how to say, "If I let go, everything will collapse." But here's what no one ever taught us. Trust is not weakness. Trust is not passive. And trust is definitely not giving up. True trust is active. It's a deliberate choice. It takes clarity. It takes courage. It requires you to breathe deeper, to take one step back, and say, I don't know exactly how this will work out. But I no longer need to force it. Letting go doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop gripping so hard that you lose yourself in the process. That's not weakness. That's strength, the kind most people never even get close to. Because it takes real courage to stop performing. To step away from the noise. To choose stillness when the world tells you to keep running. Socrates once said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." And if you take a long, honest look at your own patterns, the constant urgency, the need to explain yourself, the exhaustion that never seems to go away, you may start to realize something. You've been living inside a loop. A loop that whispers, you only matter if you're producing. You're only worthy when you're exhausted. You haven't done enough unless you're running on empty. But let's be clear. Exhaustion is not a badge of honor. It's often a signal. A warning light telling you that your energy is bleeding out into people, plans, and problems that were never meant to be yours in the first place. Because effort without alignment? That's not growth. That's suffering. You can sprint at full speed and still be completely lost. You can be busy every minute of the day, and still miss your life. That's why trust matters. Not because it makes things faster, but because it realigns you with what truly matters. It puts you back on your path, not by pushing harder, but by turning inward. Aristotle once said, knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. And here's the truth. Trust begins right there, with self-awareness. Not when you're proving, producing, or achieving. But when you're still. When you're quiet. When there's nothing left to earn. So, who are you then? Who are you when the striving stops? When you're not trying to win approval, not trying to chase the next milestone? Who are you without the constant effort to micromanage every outcome? Most people never find out. Because silence is uncomfortable. Stillness feels like failure. And spaciousness? It feels threatening, like something's missing. But that space, that silence, is not empty. It's where recalibration begins. It's where the noise fades, and the signal finally comes through. That's where clarity lives. That's where insight starts to whisper. Plato once said, a life without balance is a life without harmony. And true balance, real harmony, doesn't come from doing more. It comes from doing less, but with greater intention. When you finally step off autopilot, when you stop pushing just to feel in control, you start to sense something else. Life begins to speak to you. Not in thunder. Not in chaos. But in the form of quiet nudges. Subtle, yet powerful, like ripples guiding you back to your core. You find it in the stillness. In the quiet peace of unexpected moments. In the seconds you didn't plan. But somehow, they just feel right. That's trust. Not a loud declaration. Not a rigid plan. But a gentle leaning, a soft yes, a subtle knowing that says, you don't have to chase everything. Because you were never meant to. You were never meant to run yourself ragged trying to earn what was already yours. You were meant to recognize it. To pause long enough to see it clearly. There's immense power in releasing what no longer responds to your presence. There's clarity in walking away from the things that only survive by feeding on your stress, your worry, your fear. And no, it won't always be easy. There will be days when the old patterns tug at you. When you'll feel tempted to go back. To fix. To explain. To prove. To force something back into place that never truly fit. But each time you choose stillness over panic. Each time you take a breath instead of jumping to solve. You reclaim a little more of your energy. And each time you choose clarity over chaos. You come home to yourself again. This is the real work. Not grinding your spirit into dust just for temporary progress. Not burning out in the name of effort. But learning, moment by moment, that what is truly meant for you will never need to be forced. Because the moment you stop measuring your worth in how much you produce, something far more valuable begins to rise in its place. Peace. Not the peace of nothing's happening. But the peace of knowing you don't have to force life into shape anymore. That you, by simply trusting, listening, aligning, are already shaping your life in a new way. And that right there is the beginning of a very different kind of power. See, most people think trust means doing nothing. That it's sitting back and waiting. As if trust is some kind of passive surrender, just hoping life throws you a bone. But real trust? It's not passive. It's power, in motion. It's not the absence of action. It's the presence of alignment. A quiet kind of strength that doesn't shout. That doesn't scramble. That doesn't panic. It simply moves, rooted, calm, intentional. Trust is a way of walking through life without needing to wrestle it into shape. Without bracing for impact every second. Without chasing what was already yours from the beginning. You don't need to force people to stay. You don't need to shrink yourself to be loved. Because that version of love, the one that only survives when you're smaller, quieter, less, was never love at all. Just being chosen, that's not love. That's fear, wearing the mask of effort. You don't need to prove your worth just to be accepted. You don't need to beg time to move faster either. Because timing? What's meant for you will come, but not when you're anxious. It will arrive when you're ready. When your heart has quieted. When you're no longer sprinting toward the future in a panic, trying to fix what hasn't even happened yet. And no, you don't need to micromanage every little outcome just to feel safe. Control might offer you a convincing illusion of security. But in exchange, it robs you, quietly, consistently, of your peace. Trust changes that. When you trust, you no longer live in tomorrow. You stop rehearsing 10 different backup plans. You stop constructing solutions for problems that don't yet exist. Instead, you come back. Back to now. Back to the only place you've ever truly had any power. Right here. Right now. This breath. This step. This heartbeat. Right here, where your breath rises and falls. Right here, where your intuition, if you're quiet enough, is already whispering the truth. Plato once said, "The first and best victory is to conquer yourself." And maybe that's what real trust is. Not controlling everything around you, but calming what's within you. It's the internal win. The sacred shift when you realize, I don't need to control the external world in order to feel stable inside. It's letting go of the compulsion to fix, to react, to plan, to prove, and instead, choosing presence, choosing awareness, choosing to listen rather than force. So ask yourself honestly, what if the breakthrough you've been waiting for isn't about trying harder, but about finally allowing? What if the answer isn't hiding in more effort, more hustle, more urgency? What if the clarity you've been chasing, the breakthrough, the peace, the release, has been waiting behind your resistance all along? We've been trained to work for everything, to hustle endlessly. So the idea of simply receiving, of being still and letting something good come to us, feels foreign, suspicious, even. But not everything valuable in this life must come through struggle. Carl Jung once said, what you resist, persists. And many of us, without even realizing it, are resisting the very clarity we crave. By refusing to pause, by refusing to trust, by refusing to allow the unfolding. But make no mistake, allowing doesn't mean you stop living. It doesn't mean you let life drift past you. It means you stop pushing against the current. It means you swim with the flow of what's real, instead of exhausting yourself trying to control the tide. When the river already knows the way, you no longer have to fight to stay afloat. You act when it's time, and you rest when it's not. You speak when words are needed, and you stay silent when silence holds more power than sound. This is the rhythm of trust. It's not about abandoning movement. It's about rejecting the frenzy. Letting go of the compulsive urgency that keeps you gasping for control. And when you finally stop trying to bend life to your timeline, when you release the desperate need to rush, something strange, almost magical, begins to happen. Things begin to unfold without friction. People start showing up, not because you chased them, but because they were aligned to meet you. Opportunities begin to open, not because you forced a door, but because the door was already yours. Even your body, your muscles, your breath, your heartbeat, starts to relax. Because suddenly, it no longer believes it has to carry the weight of the entire universe to keep everything from falling apart. Aristotle once said, nature does nothing in vain. And if that's true, then the pauses, the delays, the detours, they are not mistakes. They are not signs that you're off track. They're part of the design, part of the unfolding, part of your becoming. But if you're too busy sprinting, too busy labeling everything that doesn't look like progress as failure, you'll miss the pattern. You'll misread growth as stagnation. You'll misjudge healing as weakness. You'll confuse stillness with being stuck. That's why allowing matters. That's why slowing down is powerful. When you allow, you reclaim your energy. You stop scattering your spirit across 100 imagined futures. You come back to what is. You begin to move, not from panic, but from purpose. You act, not to prove your worth, but because your steps are aligned with something deeper, something clear. And that shift, it changes everything. It turns effort into impact. It transforms chaos into clarity. Socrates once warned, beware the barrenness of a busy life. He understood something we're still learning today. That endless activity is not the same as effectiveness. That motion doesn't always mean meaning. That effort, without direction, simply drains the soul. So maybe, the next time you feel the urge to double down, to fix something that isn't broken, to chase validation or kick open a locked door, just pause. Take a breath. A real one, slow, full, and present. What if this isn't about doing more? What if this is your moment to trust more? Because that gentle shift from force to faith, from control to surrender, isn't weakness. It's the very place where your true power begins to rise. Not in how much you can carry, but in how much you're finally willing to set down. We try so hard to prove something that's already true. We bend ourselves into shapes for the approval of people who were never meant to define us. We spend years, decades even, exhausting our minds and bodies, chasing validation we already deserve. Somewhere along the way, the lie took root that we, as we are, aren't enough. Not unless we wrap ourselves in perfection. Not unless we package, polish, and parade who we are in front of the world, hoping someone claps loudly enough for us to believe it too. We've been told that raw presence, simply being, isn't enough. That it must be backed up with constant performance. So we explain ourselves, even when no one asks. We overanalyze every word we said, every mistake, every awkward moment. We show up in places our spirit has long since left, not because we want to, but because we're afraid not to. There is a difference between effort and fear. And most of us are running on fear, while calling it commitment. We say yes when our bodies scream no. We fill our schedules to the brim because empty space makes us nervous. Rest starts to look like weakness. Stillness feels like failure. And slowing down? It becomes the ultimate risk. Because what if we stop moving? What if we finally let go? What if all the spinning plates come crashing down? What if everything we've been desperately holding together just falls apart? Carl Jung once said, "A man who has not passed through the inferno of his passions has never overcome them." And maybe that's part of the journey too. Maybe all this chasing, all this noise, isn't really about ambition at all, but about outrunning the fire inside us. Avoiding the silence. Avoiding the truths we've buried under our productivity. Truths like, I'm scared I'll never be enough. I'm afraid of stillness because I don't know who I'll be without the noise. I've worked so hard to be seen, but I've forgotten how to see myself. But here's what changes everything. Here's what turns the fire into clarity, and the silence into healing. What's meant for you doesn't need to be chased. It doesn't need to be convinced. It doesn't need to be wrestled, won, or worn out for. It simply needs one thing: that you become still enough to recognize it when it comes. Because recognition doesn't come from performance. It comes from presence. Let that settle for a second. Recognition, true recognition, is not a reward for effort. It's an act of awareness. A quiet moment of clarity. And clarity? It doesn't bloom when you're tangled in panic. When you're micromanaging every corner of your life like it's about to fall apart. Clarity arrives in the stillness. In the breath you actually feel. In the moment you stop trying to impress, and start being honest. When you stop bracing for disappointment, and start leaning into trust. That's when your eyes begin to see again. That's when your heart stops defending, and starts receiving. Aristotle once said, "Knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom." But how can we ever know ourselves? When we're constantly bending to meet standards that aren't even ours. When we're so caught up in becoming who we think we should be, that we forget the truth of who we already are. This is the trap. We mistake fear for discipline. We confuse effort with worth. We call movement progress, even when it leads us nowhere but further from ourselves. But then, there's a moment. It's subtle. It doesn't shout. But it's powerful. It's the moment something inside you shifts, and you finally see it. The difference between what you've been chasing and what's been quietly waiting for you to slow down. Waiting not for you to stop, but for you to become aware. To notice. To feel the alignment. To recognize that sometimes, the most important breakthroughs don't come through more effort, but through deeper awareness. And you can't reach that awareness when you're trapped in the cycle of proving, defending, performing, pushing. Plato once said, "The beginning is the most important part of the work." But beginning again, not from fear, not from panic, but from truth, that takes more courage than all the striving in the world. Because now, the work changes. It's no longer about earning something from outside of you. It's about reclaiming what's already within. What's always been there, waiting beneath the noise. And here's the hard part. You will be tempted to go back. To explain yourself. To shrink. To strive. To fit back into a version of life that once felt safe, even if it was suffocating. Yes, there will be moments when it's tempting to try just a little harder, to push a little more, to be a little louder. You'll feel that familiar urge rise. The one that whispers, "If I just do more, maybe I'll feel okay again." But each time you pause instead of react, each time you choose stillness over desperation, each time you say no from self-respect instead of yes from fear, you reclaim something vital. Your alignment. Your inner center. The place where peace begins to return. Socrates once said, "To find yourself, think for yourself. And thinking for yourself. Feeling for yourself. Living for yourself. That's what trust makes possible. Not just trust in the timing of life, but trust in your own enoughness. Trust that you're not behind. Trust that rest doesn't mean you've quit. Trust that what's real, what's truly yours, will always know how to find you. Without theatrics. Without burnout. Without the constant chase. Because the very moment you stop trying to prove you're worthy, is the moment you begin to realize you already are. Trying is noisy. It clutters the mind. It overloads the calendar. It fills your nervous system with static, with pressure, with a constant low hum of not yet, not enough. You can feel it in your shoulders, tense and tight. You can feel it in your jaw, clenched without even noticing. You can feel it in that restless corner of your mind that never stops scanning, fixing, adjusting. It's that quiet internal narrative that says, Unless I'm solving something, I must be falling behind. Trying always demands attention. It wants to be seen. It wants results. It operates from a place of lack. Because let's be honest, if you truly felt whole, would you be pushing so hard just to fill the silence? But trust. Trust is different. Trust is quiet. It doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need to be noticed. It doesn't need to arrive at some finish line to feel complete. Trust just is. It lives in the subtle spaces, in the pause between thoughts, in the breath you finally release after holding it all day, in the decision to stop forcing something that doesn't feel right, even when you could. And no, trust is not passivity. Trust is presence. It's the ability to hold stillness without interpreting it as failure. It's the strength to stop doing, just long enough to remember who you are when you're simply being. Ironically, the moment you stop grasping, the very things you were once chasing begin to arrive. Not because you worked harder. Not because you pushed more, planned better, or stayed up later trying to make it all fit. But because, for the first time in a long time, you became still enough, open enough, to receive. And that's the key. You stopped trying to force. You stopped sprinting toward things that were never running away. You stopped mistaking your exhaustion for progress. Carl Jung once wrote, "What you resist not only persists, but will grow in size." And isn't that the truth? So much of what we call effort is actually resistance in disguise. Resistance wrapped in ambition. Disguised as productivity. Painted as progress. But deep down, it's resistance to not knowing. Resistance to slowing down. Resistance to the terrifying possibility that, maybe, if we stopped pushing, we'd lose control. But here's the truth no one likes to say out loud. That kind of resistance? It builds pressure. And pressure clouds everything. It tightens the mind. It clenches the spirit. It fogs the lens we see life through. Tension blocks the very clarity we say we're craving. And suddenly, we become blind. Not to what's missing, but to what's already here. Think about it. How many rushed decisions have you made? Not because you failed, but because you were afraid? How many jobs did you take because waiting felt like falling behind? How many relationships did you dive into just to escape the loneliness of uncertainty? How many conversations, choices, or commitments did you make out of panic? Just to avoid the discomfort of patience? And then what? How often did you end up circling right back into the same chaos you were trying to escape? Only this time, with a nicer label on it, calling it progress. When deep down, you knew it was just motion. Because silence scares us. Not because it's dangerous, but because it reveals. It strips away the distractions. It turns down the noise. It holds up a mirror. And in that mirror, we see everything we've been trying not to face. All the internal noise we've been drowning out with busyness. All the questions we've been running from. All the parts of ourselves that are still learning how to be okay. Without praise, without plans, without noise. But trust. Trust teaches something else entirely. That silence isn't empty. It's sacred. It's the space where life breathes without being told how. It's where guidance doesn't demand. It whispers. It's where intuition returns like an old friend. Soft-spoken but strong. And in that space, fear begins to lose its grip. Plato once said, "The greatest wealth is to live content with little." And maybe little doesn't mean less. Maybe it means less chaos. Less proving. Less noise. Maybe it means more peace. More clarity. More room to hear the voice inside you that's been drowned out by the chase. That kind of contentment. The quiet steadiness that doesn't crave constant stimulation. Isn't something you find through grasping. It's something you discover when you release. When you let go of the belief that urgency equals value. That speed means success. And in that sacred, quiet breath, you finally realize the world hasn't stopped moving. You've just stopped clinging so tightly. Trust begins in the quietest of acts. In stepping back. Even when every fear inside you is screaming, push forward. It's that pause. That breath before the response. That choice to wait a little longer. To feel instead of react. To listen instead of rush. To align before you move. And in that space. A space that most of us are never taught to make room for. You begin to see something vital. The difference between what's truly meant for you. And what you've simply been conditioned to chase. Yes. Trying might get you there faster. It might give you the illusion of momentum. The metrics, the progress, the praise. But trust ensures that when you finally arrive, you're not burned out. You're not bitter. You haven't lost your peace, your center, your soul along the way. You arrive whole. Socrates once warned. Beware the barrenness of a busy life. And if you've ever reached every goal, checked every box, won every race, only to find yourself more anxious than ever, then you already understand exactly what he meant. In a world obsessed with pace, trust is rebellion. It's a radical return to inner knowing. A quiet refusal to panic. A bold reminder that not everything valuable needs to be chased down, cornered, or conquered. Some things, especially the most meaningful ones, arrive not through force, but through readiness. And sometimes, readiness doesn't look like doing more. Sometimes, it looks like doing less. Not because you've given up, but because you've finally learned how to receive. Because you've stopped mistaking exhaustion for excellence. Still, if you've spent years believing that pain is the price of progress, then trust won't feel like freedom, at least not at first. It'll feel like fear. It'll feel like failure. Because when you've been trained to equate worth with struggle, anything that doesn't hurt enough starts to feel suspicious. Letting go, even a little, feels like slipping. Feels like losing ground. Feels like falling behind. But here's the truth. You've been climbing a mountain that may not even be yours to climb. And that's where it gets hard. Because the struggle, the suffering, it's become part of your story. You've woven your identity into the hustle. You've wrapped your self-worth around your ability to endure discomfort. You've learned to measure your value by how much pain you can carry without breaking. Somewhere along the way, you started believing that burnout was a badge. That the more exhausted you were, the more dedicated you must be. That if you're constantly anxious, constantly wired, constantly pushing, you must be on the right path. But what if? What if all that tension isn't a sign you're making progress? What if it's a sign you're moving out of alignment? Carl Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And for many of us, there's an unconscious belief quietly steering the wheel. That we must suffer to succeed. That pain is proof of purpose. That exhaustion equals dedication. That if it's not hard, it's not valuable. It's subtle, but powerful. This belief makes rest feel like laziness. It makes ease feel unearned. It convinces you that unless you're constantly proving your worth, you're not enough. But what if that belief isn't truth? What if it's just tradition, passed down, never questioned? Here's a different thought. What if the life you want, the one with peace, joy, and deep meaning, doesn't live in effort? What if it lives in alignment? What if it's not about grinding until you collapse, but about choosing what resonates with your soul? Deeply, honestly, fully, without needing to force it into place? That shift, from effort to alignment, is so gentle it almost goes unnoticed. But it changes everything. Because alignment doesn't ask you to abandon responsibility. It asks you to stop abandoning yourself. It doesn't mean you stop showing up. It means you stop showing up from desperation, from panic, from fear that you're falling behind. When you move from alignment, your actions still matter. But they're no longer soaked in urgency. They come from clarity, from calm, from a place inside you that isn't scrambling for permission to exist. Aristotle once said, "Pleasure in the job puts perfection in the work." And it's true. When you're aligned, work still takes energy. But it doesn't feel like suffering. There's rhythm. There's breath. There's purpose. You're not dragging yourself through every day, hoping to finally feel worthy at the finish line. You start to feel it now. In the way you walk. In the way you breathe. In the way your body stops bracing, because it knows it's finally safe. But here's the catch. Letting go of the suffering also means letting go of the story that told you you were valuable because of it. And that can feel disorienting. Like losing a part of yourself. Like standing at the edge of an identity you no longer need, but don't yet know how to leave behind. Because when your whole sense of worth has been built on endurance, on how much you can carry, on how many sleepless nights you survived, then freedom doesn't feel light at first. It feels empty. You ask, who am I if I'm not proving something? Who am I without the pressure? Here's the answer. You are someone who is beginning again. Not from lack. Not from fear. But from wisdom. From truth. From the quiet, powerful place that knows you were never meant to suffer to be worthy. Duoi de la fan viet li trang 13. Type noi amuot marti u trang 12. Noi dung duok mo rong con 40%. Junien y acute gawk. Dien dat bang gong ke sao sak. De cam zak. Ngat kao vardau kao ro rang. Ket tuk fan ni bang momo dan nain hang sang trang 14. Kao dan mo dao, ket noi trang 12. And as you begin again, not from fear, but from wisdom, you realize something deeper. Peace was never about doing less. It was about betraying yourself less. Page 13, rewritten, English. You become someone who finally understands that peace isn't the absence of effort. It's the absence of self-betrayal. It's not about giving up. It's about giving back, to yourself. To your own body, your own mind, your own soul. Because your body wasn't built to be at war with itself. That tightness in your chest. That jaw you keep clenching. Those shoulders locked in tension. Those aren't signs of strength. They're signals. Messages from your nervous system saying, this isn't sustainable. And your mind? It wasn't designed to live in a constant state of fight or flight. Of always reacting, always bracing, always pushing. And your spirit? It wasn't born just to survive every day. It was born to live. To experience, to feel, to rest. To expand, not contract. Socrates once said, the secret of change is to focus all of your energy not on fighting the old, but on building the new. That is what alignment offers. Not a rejection of growth, but a redirection. A turning away from punishment, and toward possibility. You stop building out of fear. You start building from faith. You stop running just to escape the past. And instead, you begin to move towards something real, something true, something that feels like home inside your own skin. Of course, letting go will still feel wrong some days. There will still be moments where the urge creeps in. To overdo. To overthink. To overcompensate. You'll feel the old pattern knocking. That familiar anxiety whispering, you're falling behind. But with time, trust becomes easier. Your nervous system softens. Your breath deepens. Your inner dialogue grows kinder. You stop mistaking chaos for momentum. You stop thinking busyness means purpose. And suddenly, the things that once felt unfamiliar, ease, rest, flow, begin to feel like home. And as your internal world shifts, the external world starts shifting too. Not because you forced it. Not because you worked harder, shouted louder, or hustled longer. But because you stopped pushing at all the wrong things. And started listening to the right ones. Because you weren't made to clench your jaw through every decision. You weren't designed to grind your way through every sunrise. That pressure in your chest. That heaviness you carry like it's proof you're doing enough. You were never meant to run on fumes of survival instead of flames of passion. You weren't designed to live in a perpetual state of bracing. To second-guess every step, hoping anxiety might somehow predict the future. There is another way, one most people forget exists. A way where choices rise not from panic, but from presence. Where movement begins with grounded clarity, not the fear of being left behind. Plato reminded us, better a little which is well done than a great deal imperfectly. Yet we inhabit a culture that rewards speed over depth. We rush because stillness feels risky, as though pausing means falling behind. But here's the quiet truth. Some of our worst decisions are born when we're merely trying to escape the silence. We run, not because the path is clear, but because the stillness makes us uncomfortable. Stillness, though, is not an absence. It is information. The place where deeper answers wait. When you stop scrambling to muscle the next step into existence, you begin to sense when something genuinely calls you forward. Not from desperation, not from fear, but from something infinitely stronger, alignment. Carl Jung observed, "Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside, dreams, who looks inside, awakes." That awakening doesn't come from pushing. It comes from pausing, from refusing to act until the action feels rooted rather than reactive. Peace, in this sense, doesn't slow you down. It sharpens your focus. It untangles what once felt knotted. It doesn't delay progress, it directs it. Because when you're aligned, you no longer need to debate every move. You stop second-guessing yourself at every turn. You don't need 5 backup plans just to feel safe. An inner knowing begins to guide you, quietly yet unmistakably. You trust, at last, that not every door must be kicked open. The doors meant for you respond to presence, not force. Aristotle believed that happiness is the meaning and the purpose of life, the whole aim and end of human existence. Yet so many of us trade joy for control, white-knuckling our way through choices, convinced that tension is the price of success. We've been taught that constant tension will keep us safe. That if we stay alert, stay hustling, stay uncomfortable, maybe, just maybe, we'll avoid falling behind. But happiness, true, sustainable happiness, doesn't grow in noise. It doesn't thrive in constant motion. It flourishes in environments where peace is allowed to speak. You don't have to give up your ambition. You don't have to lower your standards. You just have to stop letting fear be the thing that drives them. There's another way. A quieter way. A way to move through life without the rush. A way to build, to lead, to grow. Not by clenching your jaw and powering through discomfort like it's a badge of honor, but by choosing the path that feels like an exhale, not a breakdown. Socrates once said, "The shortest and surest way to live with honor in the world is to be in reality what we appear to be." That's alignment. That's when your inner world and your outer choices begin to match. When the things you say, the things you chase, and the things you tolerate are no longer in quiet conflict with each other. That's when you stop living reactively, and start living intentionally. That's what peace offers you. Not perfection, but permission. Permission to pause, to slow down, to wait, to breathe, to stop running simply because the world expects you to. Because in the stillness, something deeper wakes up. Something old. Something true. The part of you that already knows where to go. The part of you that never needed panic to move forward. The part of you that leads, not from fear, but from knowing. And that part of you? That's the one that leads to everything real. You don't need to fight your way into rooms that weren't built for you. You don't need to burn out proving that you belong somewhere you were never meant to stay. That kind of striving doesn't lead to belonging. It leads to exhaustion. And maybe you've felt it. The ache of always adjusting. The subtle pain of trying to fit into a space that requires you to shrink. To perform. To explain your worth rather than simply embody it. But the truth is, you don't need to convince life to notice you. You were never invisible to the things that were truly aligned with you. You don't need to wave your arms and shout just to be seen. You don't have to raise your voice, wave your arms, or overcompensate just to be noticed. In fact, the harder you try to prove you're enough, the further you drift from the part of you that already is enough. Because at a certain point, the performance pulls you away from your own center. What if, instead of forcing, you simply stopped resisting your own flow? That quiet inner rhythm beneath all the noise. It isn't always fast. It isn't always loud. But it is always honest. And when you choose to follow it, something almost magical happens. People start meeting you differently. Not because you demanded attention, but because your energy changes the room. You're rooted. You're real. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." When you stop resisting who you are, when you quit fighting for spaces that ask you to abandon yourself, the world begins to shift. Opportunities no longer feel like pass/fail exams. They feel like invitations. Conversations feel less like transactions, and more like authentic connections. You speak, not to impress, but to relate. And in that exchange, people don't simply hear you. They feel you. They feel your presence. Not because you were louder or sharper or quicker, but because your calm made space for something genuine to emerge. You stop trying to control the narrative. And instead, you start living the truth. And truth has a magnetic way of drawing in what's real. When you no longer need to be chosen, you begin choosing, with calm discernment. You stop settling for anything that vibrates beneath your value. That's the power trust brings. It isn't flashy. It isn't dramatic. It doesn't need to dominate a room in order to be felt. Because authenticity, by its very nature, already carries weight. This kind of presence doesn't crave applause. It doesn't need to be celebrated to feel valid. It holds a quiet confidence. The kind rooted in someone who finally understands that alignment will always do more than performance. It's a grounded strength. The kind that doesn't panic when the path is unclear. Because it trusts that clarity isn't rushed. That direction doesn't have to be forced to be real. Plato believed, truth is the beginning of every good thing, both in heaven and on earth. And trust? Trust is what gives truth space to rise. When you stop hiding behind your effort, behind the masks, behind the endless explanations, your essence begins to speak for itself. That's when things begin to shift. Not because you chased them, but because you finally stopped getting in your own way. There's something magnetic about someone who isn't trying so hard. They're not desperate to prove, to please, to persuade. Their energy feels safe, steady. It draws in people who aren't looking for a performance. They're looking for presence. Not the sparkle of perfection, but the stillness of truth. And that kind of presence? That unapologetic stillness? It can't be faked. It can't be manufactured. It must be lived. Socrates once said, "Be as you wish to seem." And that's what trust allows. It closes the gap between who you are and how you show up. You become consistent, internally and externally. You no longer need to chase, to rush, to control, to perform. You just need to stand still. Fully. Authentically. Unshaken. Because when you stop resisting your own rhythm, you don't just find peace. You become peace. And peace doesn't push. It pulls. It doesn't chase. It calls. And what responds to that kind of call? Everything real. Everything meant. Everything lasting. But the question still lingers. How do you start trusting? When all you've ever known is control. When your first instinct is to overthink. To plan 10 steps ahead. To step in and fix something before it even has the chance to go wrong? Letting go of that old pattern. The pattern of control, of urgency, of always stepping in, doesn't happen all at once. It's not a lightning strike. It's a quiet shift. A slow, steady return to self. It begins in the small, unremarkable moments. Moments that feel like nothing on the surface. Like pausing before you react. Not jumping to answer every email. Not rushing to fix every situation. Not over-explaining yourself just to keep the peace. That pause, as small as it seems, is power. Because that pause creates space. And in that space, something subtle but profound begins to shift. You start saying no, without guilt. Not to push people away. Not to be difficult. But because, finally, you're learning how to listen to yourself. You stop bending your boundaries to make others more comfortable. You stop saying yes just to avoid the sting of guilt. You start believing, deeply, that your needs matter too. And that saying no doesn't make you selfish. It makes you honest. Then comes the stillness. At first, it's uncomfortable. That silence, the one you use to drown in distractions, it feels unfamiliar, even frightening. Your instincts kick in. You want to fill the silence with something. Noise. Tasks. Scrolling. Planning. Anything that feels productive. But this time, you don't. You stay. You breathe. You sit inside the stillness instead of running from it. And instead of fearing the quiet, you begin to hear something within it. A voice. Your own. Not the voice shaped by expectation or urgency. Not the one that performs or pleases or hustles. But the one that knows. The one that remembers who you were before the proving began. The voice that doesn't rush. Doesn't panic. Doesn't explain. It just knows. Carl Jung once said, you wake up. Not to some dramatic reinvention of yourself. Not to some flashy transformation. But to the real version of you. The version that's been quietly waiting beneath the noise. The version that never needed to prove or perfect in order to feel worthy. The you who knows, deep in your bones, that you're already whole. Already enough. This is trust. Not blind optimism. Not pretending everything is fine. Not faking strength when you feel like collapsing. No, trust is about coming home to yourself. It's about learning how to feel discomfort without trying to fix it right away. It's about letting hard moments pass without immediately rushing in to control them. It's about sitting still long enough to hear what's actually true. Trust doesn't ask you to be passive. It asks you to be present. It doesn't ask you to give up, it asks you to stop running. To start listening. Aristotle once said, "Knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom." And trust is part of that knowing. It's the moment you stop outsourcing your worth. The moment you stop chasing approval like it's the key to your existence. The moment you stop managing every possible outcome as if your survival depends on it. Because when you truly trust, you no longer need to hold everything together to feel safe. You begin to understand something sacred. Nothing real will ever require you to betray yourself to keep it. You don't lose your ambition. You just stop confusing effort with worth. You don't lose your drive. You just stop letting fear drive it. And in return, you gain a deeper kind of strength. Not the kind that shouts to be seen. Not the kind that burns out just to feel valid. But the kind that stands, quiet, unwavering, rooted. Socrates once said, "To find yourself, think for yourself." And when you finally trust yourself, when you no longer filter your actions through fear or performance, you give yourself permission to think, to feel, to act from a place of truth. Not from habit. Not from panic. Not from someone else's idea of who you should be. And when that happens, life begins to shift. Not always in ease, but in clarity. Not always lighter, but realer. More grounded. More honest. More you. You stop trying to be everything for everyone. You stop stretching yourself impossibly thin just to prove that you can carry the weight of every room, every role, every expectation. And in that stopping, in that sacred, quiet stillness, you begin to remember who you are. Not the version shaped by pressure. Not the one constantly rearranged to fit into boxes you never chose. But the version of you shaped by peace. The version that never had to earn love, or success, or belonging. Because you already belong. You already are. And that's what trust brings you back to. Again and again and again. You don't need to become anything else to be worthy. You don't need to upgrade, outperform, or prove. You simply need to remember who you were before the world convinced you to prove it. That's the quiet power of trust. It returns you to yourself. Not with noise. Not with urgency. But with a whisper that says, "You were never lost, just buried." And if this message stayed with you, if something in these words felt like a homecoming, like something you didn't know you needed until now, then take a moment. There's a video on your screen now. It's not random. It's here for a reason. There's something in it. Some reflection, some truth, some piece of you, waiting to be remembered. Go there. Let it continue what this message began. And before you go, thank you. Thank you for being part of Stoic Journal. Your presence here means more than you know. You didn't just click on a video. You chose yourself. You chose presence. You chose truth. And for that, we're grateful. Until next time. Stay steady. Stay grounded. And remember, peace isn't something you chase. It's something you come home to. You've tried. You've pushed. You've fought to make things happen. But maybe, just maybe, what you're chasing isn't meant to be forced. Sometimes, strength isn't found in action, but in stillness. Not in control, but in surrender. A Stoic doesn't fight the river. He learns to float with it. So if you're tired, breathe. If you're lost, pause. If it's not flowing, stop forcing.